This is BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. Our top stories. A key moment in the campaign for racial justice as Minneapolis council members pledged to dismantle the city's police force following the death in custody of George Floyd.
Our commitment is to end our city's toxic relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, to end policing as we know it.
Hundreds of mourners are expected to pay their respects to George Floyd at a memorial in Houston, his hometown. The United States formally requests Prince Andrew be questioned about his friendship with the convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. And New Zealand lifts all lockdown restrictions but keeps borders closed as it declares the country virus-free. Hello and welcome to BBC World News. We begin in the United States, where the City Council in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed at the hands of 4 police officers, has pledged to dismantle the local police department. In a move aimed at combating racism, the majority of councillors said a new model of public safety would be created. Among the other developments we're expecting on Monday, a public memorial service will be held for George Floyd in Houston, his home city. The Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden is flying to Houston for a private meeting with Mr. Floyd's relatives. He's expected to send a video message to be played at the memorial. A little later, Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer charged with the second-degree murder of Mr. Floyd, is due to make his first appearance in court. Well, the decision by Minneapolis City Council to dismantle the police force comes after more protests across the United States. Council President Lisa Bender says they're acting to keep the community safe.
Our commitment is to do what's necessary to keep every single member of our community safe and to tell the truth that the Minneapolis police are not doing that. Our commitment is to end our city's toxic relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, to end policing as we know it, and to recreate systems of public safety that actually keep us safe.
That was Minneapolis Council President Lisa Bender there. Well, the move to replace the Minneapolis Police Department has to now be enforced and will be done without the support of the city's Mayor Jacob Frey. He openly opposed the decision.
You're asking whether I'm for massive structural reform to revise a structurally racist system. The answer is yes. If you're asking whether I will do everything possible to push back on the inherent inequities that are literally built into the architecture, the answer is yes. If you're asking whether I'm willing to do everything I possibly can throughout the rest of my term to make sure that the police union, the police contract, the arbitration system, and some of these policies that have resulted in problems specifically for black and brown people, and murder, by the way, over a series of generations, I'm all for that. I'm not for abolishing the entire police department, and I'll be honest about that too.
Well, our correspondent in Washington, Gary O'Donoghue, told me what police reform might look like.
Well, there's going to be some legislation proposed today for reform of law enforcement by the Congressional Black Caucus. For example, the President is also meeting members of law enforcement at the White House today. And of course, you've got places like Minneapolis already talking in pretty radical terms about dismantling their police force. Now, I don't think anyone thinks that means suddenly the police disappearing off the streets of Minneapolis. What they're talking about, in a sense, is having a takeover by a different municipality, a different county, something that represents a complete restructuring, different kind of approach, addressing the systematic problem. And of course, there is also people, and there's been pressure for this for some time from reform groups, for what's called defunding the police. That's taking large amounts of money away from police departments, redirecting them to other kinds of services, particularly in the cities, social service, mental health services, that kind of thing, who can deal with problems perhaps better than police can. And certainly in Los Angeles, they are talking about that in very concrete terms. The Americans spend $115 billion a year on policing, and many people believe some of that money, quite a lot of that money, could be better spent addressing the needs of communities that feel that the police are more of a threat than they are protection.
That was Gary O'Donoghue, and as Gary was mentioning, the vote to disband the Minneapolis police by city councillors has been approved, but the details of how they will achieve reform are unclear. Broadly, the plan calls for some money and responsibilities to be diverted from police forces to social services agencies, such as mental health services, jobs programs and arts groups. A community process for creating alternative systems will need to be worked out. For instance, operators who answer emergency calls may be asked if the caller needs police, fire or mental health services before dispatching a response. There may be more reliance on self-policing by the community, with police stepping in only when a true emergency arises. Well, let's go to Massachusetts now. For us is Alex Vitale, author of The End of Policing and professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. Thank you very much, Alex, for joining us. Is this quite a complicated process?
Yes, I think it is. And just to, correct what your correspondent said, they're not talking about a takeover from another department. They're talking about initiating a year-long process of consulting with communities about what their real public safety needs are, and then attempting to develop non-police solutions to that. And at the end of that process, dramatically shrinking the footprint of policing, and quite possibly with entirely new personnel who are hired with the understanding that their job is to try to support those community-based interventions.
Is there a particular place in the United States where they've done this, it's worked, and they can look at it, look to it as a model?
No, we really are in some uncharted territory here. But having said that, we've really seen this radical expansion in both the budgets and the scope of policing over the last 40 years. School policing, putting the police in charge of homelessness, mental health services. These weren't really important police functions 40 years ago, and they're not important police functions in much of the UK and Europe. So in some ways, it's just about returning us back to where we were a generation or two ago.
So you talk about sort of ultimately phasing police off the streets.
Well, not exactly. I mean, we're trying to figure out what the best strategy is for making communities safer. And unfortunately, we've had a lot of really kind of toxic politics in the U.S. that thinks policing is the best solution to a whole set of problems. And hopefully what we're seeing on the streets right now is a changing of the political tide that demands that we return to finding more humane ways to manage our problems, and also trying to, address some of those root economic and racial inequalities that are driving these problems.
Alex, you talk about uncharted territory. I mean, there's so many questions that one could ask about this, how and what. And I suppose there are those who, when they look at the word disbanding, they sort of think, who would I call, if I did need the police, or traditionally would go to the police if I needed help?
Yeah, that's not really what's being talked about here, and there are a lot of problems with language. As I said, this is uncharted territories in some way. There will continue to be police services available in Minneapolis for the foreseeable future. There will be an emergency response capacity, and we instead will just begin to focus on those things where police are the wrong tool for that problem. And what the end of that process looks like, I think it remains an open question.
Because there is also this debate between this and reform, and Minneapolis, frankly, has tried reform, and it clearly hasn't worked.
I think that's at the center of this conversation, right, is that 5 years ago, 6 years ago, in the wake of the deaths of Eric Garner and Sandra Bland and so many others, we were told that a set of kind of superficial procedural reforms would fix policing, and it just hasn't worked. And that's why we're having this more constructive, and I think, getting to the heart of the matter conversation about what really is the appropriate role of policing.
And I suppose the question then is, do you think this will work?
I think that the question is whether or not we can, marshal the political forces to fully implement this. And I think that we're on the cusp of a new politics. especially at the local level. My concern is that in Washington, there isn't a political appetite to dial back over criminalization, and there's going to need to be a lot more work done there.
But I suppose when you look at the United States, actually so much can be done on a local and state level.
Policing in the U.S. is almost entirely a local matter. We have between 18 and 19,000 independent local police departments. So yes, this is something that local mayors could really make a big difference in. And we're seeing New York, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, San Francisco all taking concrete steps in this direction.
And I suppose it's also about the community policing itself and shifting that culture of reliance on the actual police.
Well, community policing can be a little tricky because sometimes that's about the community bringing their problems to the police for the police to solve, when we don't think police should be the ones solving the problems. But should the people who work in all types of city government respect the needs and wishes of the community? Absolutely.
And it's also about the police, I suppose, this cultural change within the police to be less reactive?
Well, that's really why they're contemplating this idea of disbanding, as was done in Camden, New Jersey, is that they feel that the institution itself is so mired in a kind of confrontational worldview with the public that reform is not really possible, and that we need to bring in entirely new personnel who were hired under a different ethos with a very different mission for policing.
Alex Vitali, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Let's take you to some live pictures now of Houston, where the memorial service of George Floyd is taking place. We can see the hearse there carrying the casket to the Houston church, and his family, friends, relatives gathered there to remember George Floyd, to honor George Floyd's memory. And as we were reporting earlier, we are expecting a video message from Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden as well. He's also due to meet relatives and family members of George Floyd as well. But you're looking at live pictures there of Houston, and that casket is going to be taken to the Houston church. You saw there the casket being taken inside the Houston church. George Floyd's family, relatives, friends going in there for the memorial service of George Floyd. It's been quite a dramatic and extraordinary couple of weeks since the death of George Floyd at the end of May. We've seen protests erupt across the United States, and we're seeing that memorial service now in Houston. Now, in the next few minutes, we are expecting to hear from House Democrat leader Nancy Pelosi, who's due to present new legislation aimed at reforming the police system across the United States. Let's turn to the coronavirus pandemic. And New York City is beginning to reopen its economy after more than 2 months of lockdown. From today, retail outlets can offer in-store pickup, and more than 32,000 construction sites in the Big Apple can also restart work. Samira Hussain, our correspondent in New York, says it's 100 days since New York confirmed its first case of the virus and told me what the easing of restrictions will mean.
The city is entering into phase one. Now, remember, the state of New York has already entered phase one several weeks ago. In fact, they're already on to phase two. Phase one is happening now for the city of New York. Remember, the population density here far exceeds anywhere else in the state, which is why it took longer for New York City to get to this place. What this means is that construction can now re-begin. We can see that retail stores can open for curbside pickup. So that means retail stores can open, people can pick up the goods from that store, but they cannot go in and browse. Now, that is of particular concern for a city like New York, where people don't normally have cars, and it is more complicated for people to engage in that kind of curbside pickup. So we've already heard from some retail stores that have said, well, they're not going to open until there's phase 2, when people are allowed to actually come into stores.
You mentioned there it's been almost 100 days since that first case. Who would have thought that we would be here where, New York would be the worst affected place in the United States, that this would be such a grim moment in its history?
Indeed, New York City was the epicenter of the coronavirus in the United States and in the world for many, many weeks. There were more than 21,000 people that have died of the coronavirus here in the city alone. And just a few weeks ago, the hospitals here were absolutely overwhelmed with 800 deaths a day. But if you listen to what some of the officials here are saying, like Governor Cuomo, the governor of New York State, and the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, they really did credit a lot of New Yorkers for the fact that they were able to adhere to a lot of the strict rules that were put in place to try and control the virus, and that's how we've gotten to this place. That said, there is a lot of concern about a second wave and more spikes, especially given the protests that we have been seeing in the wake of the death of George Floyd. There have been so many thousands of people that have been crowding to the New York City streets for days and weeks now. And there's worry that there may be an increased number of coronavirus cases as a result of that.
Samira Hussain reporting there from New York. Now, while most of India reopened malls and religious places on Monday, the financial city of Mumbai has little activity on the roads as a few offices and businesses reopened. COVID-19 cases continue to mount in the city. BBC Hindi's Janvi Muley reports.
India is reopening some of its public spaces, but Mumbai continues to be largely under lockdown. However, as concerns over economy grow, more businesses are allowed to be open in the financial capital of this country. More government and private offices opened up and will be working with 10% of their employees. People are queuing up outside office buildings for temperature checks. City's public bus service provider BEST has started more services with social distancing norms. All malls, shopping complexes and most of the big shops in main markets remain closed, except for medical, grocery, hardware stores. Since couple of days, people are allowed to take a walk or exercise between 5 a.m. to 7 p.m. Even as restrictions are eased, the worrying situation continues in Mumbai. Till now, over 48,000 people have tested positive for coronavirus in the city, and the number is expected to go up in coming days. Janvi Muley, BBC News, Mumbai.
Now, most people entering Britain will have to self-isolate for 2 weeks under new rules coming into force today, aimed at stopping the spread of the coronavirus. The rules apply to arrivals from all countries except the Republic of Ireland. 3 airlines have launched legal proceedings against the government, arguing that the quarantine is disproportionate and irrational. The government says the measure will help prevent a devastating second wave of the virus. Now, let's bring you some live pictures from Washington, where House Democrat leader Nancy Pelosi is about to speak, as Democrats in the House of Representatives and the Senate are expected to present legislation aimed at reforming the police. Let's just have a listen in.
That tragedy, that horror of history, and then slavery in our own country, and then all of the consequences of that. We're here to observe that pain. We are here to respect the actions of the American people, to speak out against that, specifically manifested in police brutality. We are here to honor George Floyd. In a moment, we will have a moment of silence, actually 8 minutes and 46 seconds of silence in honor of George Floyd and so many others who lost their lives or were abused by police brutality. Before that, I want to yield to the distinguished Leader of the Senate, Mr. Schumer.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for this profound and important moment before we go forward with our strong and comprehensive legislation. Now, Senate Democrats held a similar moment of silence last week, where we stood for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to mark the horrible death of George Floyd. To every one of us, it was excruciating. It seemed an unbearably long amount of time. It felt so painful to get even an inkling of how this man and so many other Black Americans have suffered for so long. Every American should try to stand in silence for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to acknowledge the pain of George Floyd and the pain of racism. When we gather in this grand hall for ceremonies, we usually begin with the Pledge of Allegiance, ending with those 3 words, justice for all. Today, as we stand in silence, rather than in a spoken pledge, let us reflect on those words, justice for all, and what we need to do to make those words actually true in our time for Black Americans and all Americans. Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leader.
Okay, we're hearing there from Senator Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. They said the House will announce a sweeping police and social justice reform measure today aimed at responding to the death of George Floyd. They will hold 8 minutes and 46 seconds of silence. That was the duration in which George Floyd took his last breath. So we will come back to that and bring you the very latest there. Now, authorities in the United States have formally asked Prince Andrew, the Queen's son, to answer questions as a witness in the criminal investigation into the convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein, who died last year. The US Department of Justice requested from the British government and said it would mean the prince, who was friends with Mr. Epstein, would be required to answer questions by American police in the UK. Andrew stepped back from royal duties following a widely criticised BBC interview in which he said he did not regret his relationship with Mr. Epstein. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell has more on the request by the US.
This is under something called the Mutual Legal Assistance Protocols, and it does mean that the British authorities are now required to assist to gain answers from Prince Andrew to the questions that the Americans wish to put to him as a witness. It doesn't mean that he's going to be bundled off to the United States, but it does mean that he is expected now to answer written questions, and if he refused to do that, he could be taken in front of a British court, a magistrate's court. It is important, of course, to stress that it is answering questions as a witness concerning what he may have seen going on.
This is something that Prince Andrew hasn't been able to shake off at all.
No, and I see no prospect of him being able to do so for the foreseeable future. You know, he's withdrawn from public life and there is no prospect of him resuming his public duties.
Nicholas Witchell reporting there. Now, New Zealand is pretty much back to normal after lifting almost all lockdown restrictions. Health officials confirmed the country no longer has any active virus cases. There will be no limits on public gatherings such as sports events, and social distancing will not be required. But the country's borders will remain closed. Phil Mercer reports.
Life in New Zealand will start to resemble what it was before the pandemic. Under alert level 1, physical distancing will still be encouraged, but there'll be no restrictions on businesses or the number of people allowed at gatherings. Its international borders, however, will stay closed. Reconnecting New Zealand with the rest of the world remains a big challenge. It's had no new COVID-19 infections for 17 days. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, says the country of 5 million people has come together to defeat the disease.
And then New Zealanders did something remarkable in our fight to beat COVID-19. We united in unprecedented ways to crush the virus. We acknowledge those, however, that we have lost during the course of our battle against COVID-19. But we have worked together as well as we could to look after as many New Zealanders as possible.
The government is desperate to revive the economy after weeks of some of the world's toughest lockdown measures. Opposition politicians say the Prime Minister was too slow to remove most of the last remaining restrictions, but they concede that it is a day of celebration.
You may now kiss your beautiful...
Authorities, though, are urging New Zealanders to remain vigilant, stressing that the global pandemic will linger, with second waves a constant reality. Phil Mercer, BBC News, Sydney.
Okay, let's go back to our top story and the memorial of George Floyd. Let's show you these images. Now, thousands of people are set to gather in Houston, Texas. You can see there the casket of George Floyd, the unarmed black man who died in police custody, which then sparked global protests. The funeral is being held, the memorial service rather, is being held in Houston, Texas. Mr. Floyd lived in the city before moving to Minneapolis, where he died at the end of May. And we are expecting to see a 6-hour public viewing of his body, which will be held at the Fountain of Praise Church in Houston. You can see his casket being taken inside the Fountain of Praise Church in Houston. We are expecting thousands of people to be gathered in Houston. Let's also go to Washington now, where we can show you live pictures where House Democrat leader Nancy Pelosi is due to speak as Democrats in the House of Representatives and the Senate are expected to present legislation aimed at reforming the police. What you're seeing there is the 8 minutes and 46 seconds of silence for George Floyd. Nancy Pelosi and Senator Chuck Schumer, amongst others, on their knees there. Let's just stay with these images for a moment.
hard to get up.
Okay, you were seeing Senate Democrats there kneeling in memory of George Floyd. They kneeled for a total of 8 minutes and 46 seconds of silence to remember George Floyd. The Congressional Democrat leaders are there not just to hold a news conference on police reform, but to also announce sweeping police and social justice reform measures in response to the death of George Floyd. So we're seeing there Senator Kamala Harris. We're also seeing Senator Chuck Schumer, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senator Cory Booker. They're all kneeling there. You can see them walking away now and getting ready to make that announcement of sweeping police and social justice reform measures in response to the death of George Floyd. Let's just take you back to the images of George Floyd's casket, which was being taken into the Fountain of Praise Church in Houston. Thousands are set to gather in Houston, Texas, to remember George Floyd. Obviously, we've seen weeks of protests, 2 weeks of protests since his death in police custody, which sparked global protests, not just across the United States, but across the globe. You're seeing the hearse there in Houston, Texas, being taken to the Fountain of Praise Church. And we're also expecting Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden to meet with his relatives, his family, as well as sending a video message at this memorial service for George Floyd. Thousands are set to gather in Houston. And this was the city where Mr. Floyd lived before moving to Minneapolis, which is where he ended up dying on the 25th of May. So demonstrations across the United States as a result of his death in police custody. And we also saw there in Washington, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi speaking about sweeping police and social justice reform measures aimed at responding to the death of George Floyd, who died in police custody in Minneapolis. We can probably show you some images of demonstrations across the United States as well. You can see they're carrying on. It's been about 2 weeks of mass demonstrations across the United States. The Black Lives Matter protests, which have gained prominence with thousands of people coming out showing solidarity for the movement, but also in memory of George Floyd, who died in police custody in Minneapolis. Let's go back to Washington now as well and just show you those pictures of what we're expecting to see shortly. Nancy Pelosi will announce sweeping police and social justice reform measures. She says the House will announce sweeping police and social justice reform aimed at responding to the death of George Floyd. We'll be back in the next few minutes with all the latest.